Hello everyone, good evening. My name is Joe Malone. I am the CEO and founder of Southern Cross. We're a safety academy, select group of special operation veterans who teach everyday people how to stay safe against violent crime here in America. I am also a certified protection professional on an international board of recognized world experts. The CPP is known to be the highest level and ranking of certification somebody can have in the security industry. I say this only as a means of validating who I am, my experience, things that I bring to the table. So today we're going to talk a little bit about human behaviors when it comes to personal safety. And in particular, we're going to be talking about our autonomic nervous system, or our sympathetic autonomic nervous system response to high stress environments. So an example of this would be, how do we react when we're being robbed at gunpoint, or when we're dealing with life-threatening criminal behavior? In studying human emotions and brain activity patterns, scientists have discovered there are 4 primary responses when exposed to perceived threats. Now, quite honestly, these could probably be broken down into just 2, but fawn is the newest category, and I just wanted to include it for relativity to study purposes. These actions are caused by the brain's most hardened neural pathways and are activated by our autonomic nervous system, or ANS. The 4 behaviors are fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. I forgot to mention that. The autonomic nervous system, or ANS, is composed of the first evolved compartments in our brain, which contain the emotional centers. This is where information has naturally evolved into going first, and this is important to realize. Everything except for smell. Our 5 senses, or 4 of the 5 senses, come in all over the body, and it goes to the spinal cord, and then from the spinal cord it begins to enter the basal ganglia, or the least evolved portion of our brain, or what some scientists call to be the least evolved portion, the most primitive portion of our brain, responsible for the most basic of life necessities. Think of yourself as a caveman, or even prior to that, depending upon what science you believe. You're a less evolved organism, meaning that you're less capable of thinking critically and clearly, and planning, and emotion, and creativity. So when anything comes into our sensory input, that data goes to the spinal cord and begins to travel up into the brain stem, into the basal ganglia. The next, or the midbrain portion, because you have the least evolved, then you have the midbrain, then you have the neocortex on the outside, which we'll cover here in a moment. The mid portion of the brain is where the fear centers are located, which are responsible in the evolutionary chain for allowing us to identify threats and to either fight, flight from those events. The other thing about the mid-center of the brain is that it also contains the limbic system, the emotional center. And why is this directly correlated? Well, when we take in information, it goes to the amygdala, the fear center of the brain, 2 times faster in some studies than it does to anywhere else in the brain. So everything immediately goes to the fear center. Is this something that's going to hurt me or harm me? That's what we automatically figure out all the time. That translates in a lot of different ways in our modern society with stress. However, I digress to, is it going to hurt me or harm me? From there, it either passes through in the no category or the yes category. And when it goes through the yes category, there is a very specific response elicited from our endocrine or chemical systems in the body because of the emotional activation within the limbic system. So if we see something like a person coming at us with a gun, we register that as a fear because all sensory input is going into that fear compartment first. We say, yes, this is a life-threatening fear. Now we all of a sudden associate an emotion of incredible great fear with this experience. Therefore, it immediately kicks into overdrive, a response from our endocrine system, or our hormone system, and it produces adrenaline and epinephrine, crazy amounts of cortisol. Short bursts of energy, you become super hyper focused, you lose feeling and sensation in your extremities. This is what's known as the sympathetic nervous system response. The sympathetic nervous system falls underneath that autonomic nervous system. All right, the other half of the autonomic nervous system is the parasympathetic, but they have nothing to do with sympathy. They have everything to do with bodily functions. And the sympathetic nervous system we have no control over, because Logically, the neocortex part of the brain, the logical part of the brain, we don't think logically because that information goes there last. So instead of being, is this really a gun? And what does this guy want? What's the meaning of life while they're participating in robbing you? Our body kicks into an emotional overdrive, which stimulates a massive dump of chemicals, which basically give you what would be superhuman powers. It's also how grandmothers can lift cars off babies and dads can fight off grizzly bears, is because of the autonomic sympathetic nervous system response to a perceived threat. That information was deciphered and processed within the amygdala, the fear center of the brain. So if this is our brain here, right, and this is where the brain stem meets the brain, information comes in through the senses, has to go through that least primitive portion first, or the most primitive portion first. Then it goes into the midbrain, that fear center, where we identify, hey, is this a threat? Say, yes, this is a threat, oh my God. And then it begins to activate the endocrine system so we could have superpowers. And then finally, it reaches the outside of everything, and that's the neocortex, where we think logically. And perhaps, yeah, this could be warranted. Or perhaps maybe we are overreacting about something, and we will logically begin to process that and then dwell ourselves down. However, the neocortex can be greatly inhibited due to the amount of cortisol and epinephrine and various other peptide substances, aminos, that are developed and dumped within the body throughout the fear response. The greater the amount of chemical influence on your physical actions, the less likely you are to think logically about something, and the longer it takes for you to think logically about something, because the abundance of those chemicals being released because of a perceived life-threatening, truly life-threatening situation, that takes time to metabolize and to dissipate. And then finally, those logical portions of our brain, the neocortex, will begin to open up and allow information and neurons to send signals through again, where we could then begin to think logically about something. So for example, if you've ever been through an armed robbery, gun pointed in your face, first time, oh my God, overdrive, you're so fearful, you don't know if you're going to naturally fight, flight, or freeze at that point, or fawn in the new case now. But after the event is over with, the chemicals begin to subside and you can think more clearly about it. It's also why we can't think of really good comebacks in arguments. If you've ever been in an argument with somebody and then about 20 minutes later, like, man, I should have totally said this to that guy, and then it would have worked out a lot better. That's because your neocortex was shutting off due to a number of factors, but due to shutting down the logical part of that brain, so your primitive system that identified the threat can respond to it accordingly. All right, so in studying human emotions, brain activity patterns, scientists have discovered that out of that, there's 4 primary automatic responses to perceived threats. These physical responses are fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. These actions are caused by our brain's most hardened neural pathways, the strongest pathways in that least primitive portion, because the further down you go, the stronger they are, and they're activated by our autonomic nervous system. The actions are activated by the autonomic nervous system, as we have just explained, a sympathetic response. The autonomic nervous system is composed of the first evolved compartments of our brain, which contain the emotional centers. This is where information is naturally evolved into going because it lies closest to the brainstem, and all sensory input, except for smell, which comes somewhere else, comes into the brain through the brainstem. Our ANS, autonomic nervous system, is activated solely by our limbic system. Remember that emotional response. Therefore, perceptions ignite emotions, right? Because perception ignites the emotion, which ignites the ANS, automatic response, which influences physical action, okay? Because this is going to cause our body to now naturally perform some sort of subconscious automatic response due to the autonomic nervous system. The ANS exists for many reasons. However, one of the most primary reasons is to give ourselves the physical advantage when faced with perceived death or certain harm. It does this by releasing, the ANS does this by releasing very specific concoction of chemicals within our bloodstream that are designed to give us superpowers. Since our brain's most primitive goals are to keep us alive and away from harm, we have automatic systems built into the primitive portions of our brains that help us defy unfavorable odds or outlast any injury or incident we endure. The autonomic nervous system is how we see grandmothers lift cars off babies and fathers fight off grizzly bears. So That is really important for us to know. Why do we respond emotionally versus logically to everything? And it's because that information goes to the midbrain, the amygdala, which is a part of or within the same area as the limbic system, which is in charge of our emotions. And then, based off of the release of the chemical concoction, which varies, by the way, which we'll kind of find out a little bit about here, highlights the importance of training and education, because the more you train and educate yourself on something like violent crime or how to handle violent crime, then the more hardened those neural pathways in the brain, those connections are becoming stronger, understanding and being able to visualize and repeat those things. So when we do, and that's why training is so much more effective, is because it elicits emotional, like a tangible response and tie and association to the actual event you're training for. So if I'm training in a personal safety course, when I'm going through the scenarios, a good instructor is going to elicit emotion from me as if though the experience is actually taking place. That will release the same chemicals in my body as would be in a real life situation, because our brain does not know the difference between fake and real, perceived or concrete. So because I'm eliciting because the same emotion is being elicited from me in the training scenario, because I am physically performing moves and motions and having to time things, I'm developing spatial awareness relative to this type of an incident, because I am walking through the entire process. All of these things act to really strengthen those neural pathways and connections in the brain and make us much more proficient in them in a much more shorter amount of time. So by performing actions and by training myself, I am becoming much more proficient in strengthening those neural pathways of performance rather than the primitive neural pathways of just energy and chemical dump, and let's kind of see where this thing goes, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. I'm rewiring my brain to say, no, this is how I need to be behaving within these situations. I know that because I've trained it enough times to where now we call it muscle memory. Things just kick in, and it's really the subconscious. And we'll talk much more about that later. But when things become subconsciously programmed within our responses to incidents, external, extrinsic influences, then that is when we are reaching the level of mastery. There's always still room for improvement, however, so don't forget that. Now, knowing this about the limbic system and how we are now emotional creatures, not only can we positively influence ourselves to feel these emotions even greater in training, to really solidify those neural connections, because when chemicals are released, it acts as a hardener, like working overtime to solidify those neural connections into those positive action responses. But I can now understand that in the active mode, when I am feeling a certain way, or like let's say I come up on a car accident, or if I'm going to have to use lethal self-defense with a firearm on myself, right? When it comes time to overcoming the emotional overdrive in those situations, I know what to do because I understand I'm an emotional creature, and if I just give myself some deep breaths, increase the oxygen within my bloodstream, remember that calm breeds calm, and think back to my training and visualize success here now in the moment, everything comes together and you become much more capable of controlling those emotions, reducing that anxiety chemical dump, that parasympathetic response, those chemical concoctions that will debilitate your neocortex, your critical thinking part of your brain. And I am able to open up that neocortex in these times of great stress, and I am able to think as clearly and as critically and as creatively as possible, which when you can do that in a fight for your life, or really just any high stress situation, with going to help take care of somebody, if you're giving a business talk or an event, when you can control the amount of anxiety-driven chemicals being dumped into your body, and you can open up the neocortex, the logical, critical thinking part of our brain, doing that in times of high stress situations will guarantee or greatly increase, because you could probably only get up to 99% of certainty in this life. It's gonna help you out a lot, infinitely well. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the four basic responses that we have. The first response I want to talk about is my favorite, and it's fight. One of the four basic ways our bodies can automatically respond to perceived threats is to fight them off. When we are unexpectedly met with a perceived threat, our body may default into what is known as the fight response, or the sympathetic fight response. Anything attempting to cause us harm can theoretically most likely be harmed itself, meaning that subconsciously or reflexively, if something jumps out at me and I turn and I punch it, my thought process isn't that I'm so tough. My thought process is that whatever's moving towards me is most likely a living thing. Might not always be the case, but the way my brain works is that it might be a living thing. And it's probably because I've trained so repetitively for this. So therefore, I need to punch the shit out of it in order to really hurt it. And if it's trying to hurt me, I want to hurt it way more than it's trying to hurt me. Because I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm just living my life. And now this thing's jumping out at me, so I need to destroy it because it wants to harm me. It wants to ruin the quality of my physical and emotional life. Since our brain's repository of past experience tells us that we are living as creatures can feel pain, we understand that other living creatures can feel pain as well, right? That's what I'm just talking about. So if threatened, we can escape the danger by fighting our way out of it, being the danger, by inflicting great pain and harm to whatever is attempting to cause us great harm. This is the most aggressive response we have to fear, and it's a good one a lot of the times. Now, obviously, if you have a wrecking ball come swinging in at you and you see it at the last second, the best option there isn't to just turn and try to punch the wrecking ball at full swing. It's going to smash you into a wall. But having an aggressive response to fear develops self-confidence and certainty within yourself. And in my opinion, at least, I think that it is the most critical thinking one out of all of them, because when you are responding from a point of aggression, you're more in control of the chemical release being dumped into the bloodstream, as opposed to absolute fear and freezing and fawning. When you are aggressive, you know, my opinion is that you're much more in control. So for example, suppose you are walking down the sidewalk heading home at nighttime, and someone jumps out from behind a dumpster and they attempt to grab you. Let's say your body kicks into fight mode and you instinctively begin punching, kicking, screaming, trying to harm the person attacking you. Your body's automatic response is to inflict as much pain as possible to free yourself from their grasp so that you may successfully get away, or to even debilitate them or neutralize them through physical force. However, upon laying punch after punch, you soon realize it was your friend trying to trick and scare you, so you just beat the crap out of your friend. So why didn't you recognize it was your friend, and why didn't you recognize it was your friend sooner before you kicked the crap out of them? Well, the primitive portion of your brain kicked into high gear long before the logical part. Long before the logical part could perceive and realize it was just one of your friends. It left your friend with an important lesson on scaring you in the future. Just don't do it. Your brain may kick into fight mode over other automatic modes for several reasons, most likely due to repeated past experiences of being taught or encouraged to fight in times of great fear. Right? We are strengthening the neural pathway that says fight in times of great fear. All right? Not run, but fight. This exposure created a solid neural pathway in the brain capable of transmitting information quickly and effectively when firing off under stress, due to the limbic system's command for action, that emotional responses command for action. Fight. Or no, this one is flight. Flight is another response in your body you may undertake when faced with a perceived threat. Flight responses may be activated if you have never been taught or encouraged to fight, right? Strengthening that neural pathway. Your brain has past experiences and information stored away that shows running from perceived threats has worked to keep you safe from harm before and hence still alive. So that's a pretty good outcome if I'm the brain. I'm saying, hey, every time I get scared, I run away screaming, flailing my arms. And that has worked out pretty good for me so far. So in these times of great perceived stress and fear, I think that the running the way is probably going to be the way that we want to go because that's the most hardened and strengthened neural pathway in the brain. Pathways established for the information or response to a perceived threat are tied to running away in fear. Just said that. Flight is one of the less aggressive responses we have to fear, but it can yield good results in the short term. Absolutely. And sometimes it is better to run than to fight. You know, I'm not going to fight a pack of wolves. If I did, that'd be awesome. However, we deal with long-term embarrassment, loss of self-identity, and loss of personal sanctity. It erodes our confidence, causes us to internalize our emotions, and can breed anger and resentment towards others who are not as cowardly as we are. Flight is subjective, as not all people will deal with this internal conflict. And that's very true. You know, it's the kid who gets picked on feels like an idiot afterwards. You know, you go home, you isolate yourself, you cry, you start to develop other chemicals and compounds and peptides in the brain like tachykinin that solidifies previous bad experiences into true trauma and agitates your behavior and your thought process. That's why we see a lot of violent crime, especially in schools. All right, flight is subjective. Not all people will deal with this conflict. Some people don't care. For example, suppose you're walking down the sidewalk and someone jumps out and grabs you in an attempt to pull you down to the ground. Since your historical behavior has had you run before, you immediately give a shout and begin running away, flailing your arms in the air while yelling and screaming. After running half the length of a football field, you turn to realize it was just one of your friends playing a joke on you. The perceived threat processed by the brain ignited the easiest pathway for any information or bodily action to travel down. In this case, it was to run. The run pathway in your brain is the one that recognizes your historical success in running from danger. Because of this, your body will initiate a run response and make every attempt possible to escape the perceived threat. Even if it is a friend playing a joke on you, you cannot realize this until after your primitive brain has already caused you to act relative to the perceived danger and threat. And that is because it shuts down the neocortex. A little bit later, you realize it and you know what's going on. All right, freeze. A freeze response may be initiated due to your brain's lack of stored information on the perceived experience you are encountering. We do not have any reference from our past experiences or very little for our brain to withdraw from our memories. Then our brain must formulate a new perception so that we have something to identify the experience and associate it with. The amount of time it takes our brain to piece together the threat level that we are facing due to the collection of bits and pieces of previous and current experiences results in the freeze response to perceived threats. Again, education, training, and experience are crucial to avoid this freeze response. And so you do not freeze due to a lack of reference in your brain's memory space. It is so you do not freeze due to a lack of reference for what's in your brain space. So when we store memories in our brain, we store memories in these clusters. And that's why we can be so certain about stuff sometimes, and then we're like completely wrong about it. And I'm subject to that all the time. Some studies will say that, you know, up to like 60% of everything you remember is somewhat falsified because we store in clusters of memory for long-term storage. Now, there are some events that we could actually remember all the details from, and a lot of the time that's largely associated with the emotional connection tied to that event or that incident, because that emotion, those chemicals solidified the neural pathway in that brain, and it is very strong. That's why a lot of people suffer from PTSD or depression, is because they replay these memories, strengthening those neural pathways in their brain, or the immediate event had such an emotional response, had such an emotional impact that it like made these things steel. Those neural pathways are never being broken without actual work to actually break away at them. So that's why a lot of PTSD comes into place, because the emotion and the chemicals and the experience and the signals currently in that brain, in your brain, passing through at that time. So when we deal with a freeze experience, anytime that we're seeing things, we're pulling in from these clustered memories, everything that we see and recognize and know. That's why when we learn something new, we have to like pause for a second and we tilt our head, because our brain has to actually go computing overdrive. You can't physically move right now. You need to keep your mouth open so I can process all this information quickly, because our brain is a supercomputer. Now, When it comes to the freeze response, okay, we have something called the reflex arc, where the time it takes for me to feel me touching my hand, for that signal to travel up to my brain, realize, and then come back and have that sensory output. You know, there's a time frame associated with that. It's like 0.128 seconds or something. I know when we see stuff, it's 0.025 seconds in the past, because it takes that much amount of time, 0.025 seconds, for me to realize what I am seeing. So same thing with feeling and touch and all that. So that amount of time is what's called the reflex arc, which could be detrimental to our ability to defend ourselves against a threat because of something called the reflex gap. And that is the amount of distance between you and a person, to where if they could sucker punch me and I don't even realize it, that is within my reflex gap. I keep people out of that all the time. 1 arm's distance is like way super high threat level, like close to me, especially if your energy is off. And I recommend that you do the same. You need to give yourself time. Remember, time equals distance, or distance equals time, and then that also equals safety. So the reflex arc is the amount of time it takes for us to realize and recognize in our brains the sensory input. The reflex gap is the amount of time it takes for us to successfully parlay or dodge or block or fight or hit back somebody else who may come in to attack us due to that reflex arc. Now, that is not a freeze response, that's a reflex gap. If somebody comes up to me and then they have a gun in my face, and then I've never seen a gun, I've never really read much about armed robberies, how they happen, never seen movies about it whatsoever, not much into getting robbed in movies. And so I have no memories, no long-term cluster memories to pull in these bits and pieces of information rapidly and quickly in order to decipher what's taking place here in front of me, the reflex arc. I'm having to completely reformulate a whole new set of circumstances and pull from some other completely different pieces of memory to try to piece together what is taking place right now. In conjunction with that, the amount of chemicals being released because of the immediacy and the energy level, feeling like the threat, but not being able to compute what's taking place in my brain, what's happening, that is like the worst chemical concoction dump that you could ever get, because it is paralyzing. Your entire body needs to remain perfectly still in this insanely intense moment in order for you to even figure out what the hell is taking place. Your brain is working in crazy super overdrive, just like when we're watching something, well, this is like the mother lode of all that, where your body's just like frozen. And a lot of the times, once your brain can quickly put that stuff together, you're still so frozen because of that parasympathetic nervous system response, that begins to even compound the fear, because now you're frozen and then you know what's going on. You're being robbed at gunpoint. This guy looks like he might kill you right now, and you're never going to say anything, and you can't even move. You can't even do anything right now. You're helpless. It's the worst chemical concoction dump that you can get, and it leaves you the most vulnerable. So how do we avoid that? Is by training, education, and experience, and creating those strong pathways in the brain. All right, Tiffany was walking back to work from lunch one Tuesday afternoon when some strangers bumped into her on purpose on the sidewalk. As she tried to get around these rude people, it almost seemed like they were bumping her around in between them, blocking her and harassing her. She couldn't understand what they were mumbling and what they were annoyingly holding in front of her face. Get your phone out of my face, she thought, and then she started to try to push one out the way. Well, it wasn't a phone in her face, it was a gun. And she then realized what happened and completely stood there shocked, fearful, and frozen. Petrified and at the complete mercy of the criminals. So once she was like staring at this cell phone thing, like, what is this in my face? Her body entered into a freeze state. She's being bumped around. And all of a sudden she realizes it's a gun. And then all of a sudden everything kicks into overdrive. She's super fearful, just like we were describing a moment ago. Long after they are gone, they were griping her and groping her and robbing her and taking her purse and her wallet, she was still standing there in shock. Now she's reached this like shocked fearful phase where it's just really a matter of getting these chemicals to die off and metabolize and dissipate. But she'll probably suffer from something called post-traumatic stress after this, or stress disorder, PTSD. You know, every time she sees strangers on the street, now her body's going to kick into overdrive. The chemical association and the strength of the neural pathways being developed right now is so insanely strong that she'll probably think and feel this way for quite some while. So because if someone walks up to you and points a gun in your face, but you have never experienced seeing a firearm before, let alone one pointing at your face, your brain will have to build the perception of how to try and react when one is pointed at your face. Because of this, it will take your brain longer to piece together the perception of a threat, resulting in a freeze response while your brain works out what is taking place. This delayed reaction is due to your brain understanding the new experience. Therefore, in the process, you will be frozen physically. Although the process of perception in our brains happens fast, we do not have the knowledge base on or how to behave or respond in this armed robbery. These compounded processes are why some people freeze while perceiving threats of harm. Indeed, the worst autonomic response we can have in times of duress. All right, lastly, let's talk about the fawn response. Now, the fawn response is new, and this is basically where you're walking down a sidewalk and someone bumps into you and points a knife at you, says, "Give me your purse." Due to the immense amount of fear, right? This is why I think fight is the best one, because you're being aggressive, you're in control of your own well-being. But in this one, again, fear. This is why I think it can usually come down to fear or fight. They say, "Give me your purse," but you don't stop there. You're so afraid this person will take your life or harm you that you begin to see your life flashing before your eyes and the gruesome death, and you just want to do whatever you can to hope that this person will get away because you truly believe that that's what will make it end. And you start giving them your phone, and then you pull your wallet, and then you give them your shoes, and then you're empowering the criminal enough to ask for everything else. Now, once you give them everything, they're going to look around and say, "Wow, I'm in charge right now." So, in this example, feeling completely in control and empowered by your compliance, the criminal demands you get in the alleyway with them. That's where it goes, because you're being the accomplice in your own crime, your own victimization. You're giving somebody complete and absolute control over you as a human being when you fawn to them. And for somebody who already doesn't value your life as a human being because they're a violent criminal threatening your life, then you're just giving them the ability to now do anything and everything that they want in order to victimize you, and they know that they're going to get away with it because you're not going to do anything about it. So you just became a dead calf to a lion just from being scared by it. Now, if we've regularly educated or trained ourselves on identifying and responding to these types of criminal behavior, our brains can quickly perceive the events unfolding before us. Our brains can decipher events based on the repository of information stored in them from those previous training education experiences. Based on behaviors we have learned about during training, we can navigate through a situation and be successful in a calmer state of mind. However, the information we process in our brain relative to the events unfolding before us is one of familiarity in this situation, because we have never trained on or become familiar with these situations, in this case the armed robbery. Then not only will we have a delayed time reaction due to the reflex arc, but we will also not have a good course of action to take due to lack of information in the brain from a lack of previous past experiences. The double entendre, I think, previous past. However, as previously mentioned, the reticular activating system's purpose is not to identify what is a threat or not. Its filters are based on whatever information we want it to be watchful for. All right. Reticular activating system, jumped a bit ahead there, is something else. So today what we covered was the autonomic nervous system. Right, we covered how the brain, a little bit how the brain has evolved. We covered where information goes in the brain first and second and third, and how that affects us physiologically, and our endocrine system, hormonally, chemically within our bodies, with the limbic system being the emotional center, the amygdala being the fear center. So remember, information comes into senses, goes through the basic part of the brain, which is the most primitive part of our brain, goes straight to the amygdala 2 times faster than anywhere else, is determined to be a threat or not a threat. And if it is a threat, it then therefore travels through the limbic system, activating the emotional endocrine emotional response, which elicits the endocrine system to kick into high gear overdrive. The chemicals get dumped into the body. That ignites significance in the event we are experiencing, which solidifies and strengthens that neural pathway into steel for whatever it is that we are currently dealing with, dependent upon the varying level of actual threat. Obviously, the most life-threatening situation, the greatest threat, is going to really make that stuff steel, whereas maybe if it's just a slightly fearful event, it's just made of some sort of weak concrete or stone. So once the body dumps into that overdrive, that stimulates the limbic system, the emotional response, the hormonal response stimulates the autonomic nervous system, and specifically the sympathetic nervous system response. That is going to allow us to conduct superhuman strength and be hyper-focused and very fast for a short period and amount of time. However, what is going to take place most likely is whatever we have trained or educated our minds for more than anything else in the past. This is the importance of having training because of the 4 basic responses that will be initiated, physical responses, by the autonomic nervous system, the autonomic sympathetic nervous system response. Those actions are fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Fight, if we do lots of education and training and visualizing success within these types of encounters, then we are increasing our chances of being successful in them and having that automatic response due to the sympathetic nervous system response to a perceived threat. If we have historically had success running from something or being fearful and jumping away from things, then that is most likely going to be the automatic response that you have. If we have no perception and are completely caught off guard and ignorant of what it is that's taking place in our surroundings and this experience, this encounter, then we will go into the freeze response because there is no course of action for us to refer to in the brain. And then lastly, fawn, which is a largely fear-driven response. And actually after today, I don't even know how much I really like talking about fawn because I feel like it really just falls into fear and fight, I think, are the 2 biggest responses we have. But fawning is where you try to over-appease your attacker, your criminal, by doing more than what they have requested in an effort to be in their good graces, but you really just end up empowering them. And that debilitates your own self-worth and value as a human being also, because think of the kid who gets picked on and bullied at school. When you get punked, you feel dumb, you go isolate yourself, chemicals, the reactions, you feel like a wimp, never going to be good enough. You start to, think some really negative thoughts due to the chemical releases in the brain. And isolation after being insulted like that really has some significant behavioral and emotional and psychological implications moving forward because of tachykinin, specifically TAC2. It's a peptide that gets released in the brain when we are isolated, and the only thing that makes it better is positive human interaction, which we'll dive into. I did some other videos on that before, but that is the phase that starts to, those are the steps that compound into why we see a lot of, active shooter violence, specifically within schools these days. And the only good thing to unravel that, to undo that negative work, is to bring us, in the positive fold with other human beings and the chemical reactions that we have when we're having a good time with other humans. It's remarkable. We as human beings are supposed to love one another and be positive and social and interactive with one another. Yes, we're supposed to have some introverted time, absolutely, to be creative and discover oneself. But we as human beings have lost track of the important significance, not just psychologically, and emotionally, but truly biologically, neurochemically, neurologically, within our brains, within our bodies, and our existence and our energy frequency output. It is all very important that we have great positive social interaction with one another. And it breeds for an appreciation of life, and people feel included. And when you have these environments, there is no active shooter violence. Like, sure, there's always going to be, the people that, slip and somehow, end up in those states. I mean, the devil is present, but in order to greatly mitigate violent crime, in order to greatly reduce victimization, and in order to greatly increase our self-confidence and belief in ourselves and our levels of comfort with one another, it really does start with knowing how to defend yourself, how to be aware of your environment and surroundings and see these things happening. And on the surface level, yes, the skill in general and being able to do that does improve your confidence and awareness and help keep you safer and allow you to be a kinder, nicer human to other people. But even deep down at the core, every single level of this stuff, it's having positive effects on the body and longevity and health and connection and communication with one another. So it's super important. It's the foundational cornerstone, the building block of our life is safety and security always first. There will be nothing else without safety and security, not even a drink of water. So keep that in mind. All right, I hope that you learned something today. This was a little bit of a talk over from one of the excerpts of the book, The Women's Safety Guide. Here it is. It has been delayed in terms of being released. Just keep your eyes out open for it. I created a women's safety guide because of the overwhelming majority of women that have been victimized by violent crime. And I discovered this one day in a corporate seminar when I was teaching, that all the women in the room had been victimized. So felt like I had to do something. All right, take care, everyone. Stay safe. Always be kind. Reach out if you have questions. Pass out this information to somebody if you think they could benefit from it. And ask me, anything you need. If you need help with anything at your workplace or personal life, let me know. Take care. Joe Malone, Southern Cross Safety Academy, Special Operations Veterans, teaching people how to stay safe against violent crime. Take care.